In the magical realm of Fairyland, our protagonist Gertrude has been named Queen and has begun a reign of terror. Everywhere she goes, she leaves behind a wake of destruction like Fairyland has never seen before. When they aren't fighting in her name, the people fear her. When she comes to their realm, a giant explosion is almost certain to follow. This rule continues uninterrupted for some time, until Gertrude's ever-reluctant companion Larry has a grim message for the Queen. Winter is coming. Miss Winters arrives and explains that Gertrude is to be fired from her position as Queen of Fairyland. Now free from such constraints, Gertrude can focus on her original goal once more, to finally find an exit to this magical world, once and for all. But nobody said it was going to be easy. Hello and welcome to Comic Island. My name is Arden, and this is my review for I Hate Fairyland Volume 2. So a while back I gave my review at the request of Jeremy Renfro, top-level Patreon supporter, of I Hate Fairyland Volume 1. If you haven't seen that video, I do suggest you go watch it, because it'll probably give some context to this one, but in short, I did not like it. I found the jokes didn't work for me, and I just really wasn't on board with this story as much as I wish I could have been. But it did end with a big twist. Gertrude was named Queen of Fairyland at the end of Volume 1, and I thought that might change the status quo enough that maybe things would be different this time around. So, with as open a mind as I could manage, I went into Volume 2 hoping for the better. Unfortunately, right off the bat, the same problems cropped up, and that part isn't terribly surprising. Because I Hate Fairyland isn't weak in its premise or its art, which is phenomenal, and Scotty Young does a commendable job with his artwork in this comic. It just looks so good, and it's just so detailed. There's pages where Gertrude goes from one domain of Fairyland to the next, and each panel is just so creative and cool, usually featuring a setting or a situation that could easily drive an entire story in and of itself. So while the artwork's amazing and the premise is pretty fun, it's the writing that really drags this thing down into oblivion. I don't find any of the jokes funny, and they're full of stuff ranging from cultural references, which is a pretty lame form of humor overall. I slipped in that Game of Thrones one for a reason, but there's also like a reference to Broad City and stuff like that, which is fine in and of itself and is kind of funny in this anachronistic world of I Hate Fairyland that really has no business knowing about these things to begin with. But it's going to make this thing feel very dated in a short period of time, and I think that's a real issue in and of itself. What I think is worse is that I Hate Fairyland to me becomes a sort of game of spot the joke. Me basically going from one guy to the next and thinking of where I saw it from before, which happens a lot. There's one part in this comic where Gertrude finds this arcade thing and gets sucked into a video game. And it's really cool because the art style changes to something that almost resembles Street Fighter. The whole thing becomes this very fun, Eastern-inspired art video game sort of thing. Except, South Park did the same joke well over a decade ago at this point. And the whole thing feels like a giant rip-off of Itchy and Scratchy. Jokes that are ranging from stuff that I've seen in Aqua Teen Hunger Force to Rick and Morty, and all sorts of other things. There's a joke in here where everyone says fluffing instead of the more obvious F word. A bit that's done in The Good Place. Now I'm pretty sure Good Place came out as a TV show after I Hate Fairyland, but The Good Place still does this joke better, and it fits in not only with the needs and desires of censors for a network TV show, but also with the general sense of the show itself and what it's all about. It's supposed to be this lofty heaven idea that's secretly kind of infuriating, so the idea that people can't swear is a very clever take on it. That degree of frustration is supposed to be inherent in I Hate Fairyland, though to a degree I just find it frustrating beyond what the comic wants you to feel. I get a sense that Gertrude is trapped here, which we're supposed to feel, but it just feels so frustrating, and not in a fun, satisfying, comedic way, just in a very I don't want to read this anymore kind of sense. There's no anchor to this story, so it just feels completely off the rails at all times, which could be fun in a good comedy, but here it just doesn't work for me. It feels like I'm just adrift in this crazy, colorful world that is fun, but also fundamentally frustrating because of that. It's difficult to describe. Let's give an example to maybe help explain what I'm saying here. In Uncanny X-Force, at one point they go to this place called Otherworld. And it's this magical domain with like kindly old wizards and stuff like that, and it has this war going on that's very complicated and all that. The idea is, when this happens in the story, things go completely insane. The second they step in Otherworld, Deadpool is immediately decapitated. There's this crazy goat casting magic everywhere and attacking the X-Force. It's really good because there's the sense of grounding to it. We had spent, up until then, the series in the real world with a, relatively speaking, grounded sense of events. So when we go to this crazy, fantastical, magical world, it feels shocking and is a really cool setting because we have something to compare it to and because we're so firmly grasped in reality within the rest of this series. I Hate Fairyland doesn't have that grounding. It just exists in oblivion, off in its own little world. So when we get this fantastical art and this very cool take on it all, even when we go into video game land and it's clearly a bit of a rip-off of stuff like South Park and even things like Wreck-It Ralph, the artwork at the very least is commendable. But without anything to anchor this story, it feels horribly lacking, and Gertrude, the only person from the real world outside of one other character, feels like a very poor choice for being that anchor. I don't relate to her at all. She's very like, oh, look at how precocious I am as I'm violently murdering all these people. And the bit is funny at times, but gets very tired after a while too. One of the best issues of this comic is actually one where the story is more anchored and it feels like things are working a little better because of it. Gertrude loses this poker game and becomes indebted to this vampire, so she goes to venture into this vault to find some old treasure she can give him. And the whole vault is infected with these weird monsters that she has to fight off. I really like that story. It worked, and it felt like it had more of that grounding, this framework around it in terms of a plot that a lot of the other issues of I Hate Fairyland don't have and desperately need. Well, here's my real issue with it, and here's where I think it falls short and starts to fit a bit of a pattern, and something I kind of want to talk about while we're here. This is by and large a solo project by Scotty Young. Jeffrey Cruz does a lot of the extra artwork with all the video game stuff, and he does a phenomenal job. And Jean-Francois Brulot from I Hate Fairyland Volume 1 does the coloring once again. But Scotty Young is the one who felt the need to put only himself on the cover of this thing, and is basically the one taking the majority of the credit for this. I would disagree personally. I say his colorist adds a ton to his artwork by giving it so much color and life to it, but I digress. Scotty Young is the one primarily responsible for this. This is one of those comics both written and drawn by the same person. And I hate those comics. Like, let's just be real right now. Some artists do a very good job writing. We don't really have to look much farther than Spawn for an example of that. But there are others out there. Yet, by and large, most artists who become writers or who do these solo projects where they write and draw something, it's a little disappointing to see it happen time and time again, but it does happen over and over, and I think it has to do with how artists tend to view writing. Very few people out there look at artwork, coloring, inking, and all of that stuff and think, oh sure, I can just start doing this without any prior experience and I'll be a professional. Most people correctly realize that that sort of work takes years of practice to fully hone your skills. Some people need a really strong education to get into it. Some people just really need to spend a lot of time doing it until they're comfortable doing it professionally. There isn't one firm route towards becoming a professional artist. Writers, on the other hand, don't tend to get that same benefit of the doubt. A lot of people assume that they can just start writing one day and they can be as good as any other writer out there. After all, you don't need the same level of skill as drawing, right? Or at least not the same level of obvious skill. But I contend to you that both of these are skills that require practice, and both of them basically require that same sort of 10,000 hours of practice people talk about when they talk about mastering any skill. So when an artist who spent thousands of hours honing their practice as an artist, making a name for themselves, decides to break into writing, largely and usually without the same level of experience or practice, it shows, and it shows every single time. I Hate Fairyland is no exception to this, and I think it's its biggest problem. Scotty Young knows his artwork and does it really well, but he seems almost oblivious, to a rather cartoonish extent at this point, of the world around him, especially the comedy world around him, because that's what he's competing against, and he utterly fails in this regard in a rather spectacular way. Look, it's one thing to not be a total expert on comedy and not to know, everything that's ever been done in every podcast, TV show, and movie that's ever been made. That's an insane thing to ask of anyone. But when you're clearly doing bits from stuff like South Park and The Simpsons, you're oblivious to, the tentpole comedy stuff done over the last 20 years or so. And that's what it feels like when I read this book. It reminds me a lot of the Deadpool Assassin series I recently reviewed on this channel, where it clearly could have benefited from somebody who writes comedy for a living, and the fact that it's not here makes this series profoundly disappointing. Yes, humor is subjective, and that's why I'm cautious to fully say that I Hate Fairyland is bad. But there's a difference between me not finding something funny, and that happens all the time, and me not finding something funny because I've seen it all before. A lot of this comedy is stuff I would have found funny a decade or two ago, and a lot of it's stuff I would have written a decade or two ago. But comedy moves on, things change, humor, jokes, and what we expect out of them evolve over time as these things develop. And my interests in comedy are pretty broad. I like weird and specific stuff, like a lot of improvised comedy podcasts such as Comedy Bang Bang and Teacher's Lounge, but I also like very broad things too. Popular TV shows such as Brooklyn Nine-Nine, American Dad, Modern Family. Those sorts of things that have a pretty broad audience and scope to their comedy, yet I find hilarious and still watch them all the time. So I really think there's issues with I Hate Fairyland beyond just, oh, I don't find it funny. I think there's issues with how this comic was written and created that make it derivative and unoriginal, and that's what makes it unfunny. So to a degree, no, it's not just subjective here, guys. There's something objectively wrong with this comic. It is either unaware or simply doesn't care that a lot of its jokes and humor derive from stuff that's been done before, and not only that, but done well and in the same way. I think that's what's the most frustrating about it. It would have been fun to go into the Street Fighter land and really have some comedic fun happening. Even though South Park's done something vaguely similar before, if you're doing something different, it's okay. But there's no joke beyond just, oh, it looks like these Japanese video games. Isn't that funny? But it's not funny. It's not even a little funny. And it's not like, oh, they're being offensive or anything like that. It's just deeply unoriginal and not saying anything with its comedy. I'm not sure what Jeremy Renfro once said of me when he asked me to do these type of reviews. I have always maintained that, I'm going to be honest when I go about them. But I have a feeling that he and other people like this series, and I simply don't. And look, you may not have seen all the comedy things that I've seen. You might not have the same mindset when you're reading this book. There's nothing wrong with enjoying it, but that doesn't mean that I don't get to criticize it, and I don't get to point out its very real shortcomings. or to point out that it's beyond just a simple difference in what I and you find funny. There's real issues with originality here that are worth addressing. Just because you didn't recognize it when you saw it, doesn't mean it isn't there. So, thanks for watching this review. I don't mean to be a Debbie Downer about these things, I just wanted to be honest when I review it. It's tough to go about these comedy things, which is why I'm very light on the recaps for them, because I don't really know of a way to do them without either stealing the jokes or me being forced to rewrite them, which I really don't want to do for something I don't find funny in the first place. So we just end up doing these sort of half reviews where I kind of briefly go over a scene or two from the actual comic and then dig into the actual content in depth. I don't think this will be the norm for most series going forward. It has to do with the unique dynamics behind I Hate Fairyland. But nevertheless, it's all there, and it's worth reviewing this series in some form or another. It's just important to keep it in a way that's fair to Scotty Young and the original project to begin with. And I think that's what this is at its core. So let me know what you think in the comments section below, and thanks for watching. If you want us to have a say in the videos we make, check out our Patreon page in the video description. And finally, don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep reading comics.